Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. The second and final day of our International Human Rights Conference. We are here for a roundtable, which will be on a very strategic topic that really touches upon our interest and passion as human rights students, scholars, and activists, which is a roundtable on human rights education, in particular human rights education in university, and the role of civil society and NGOs in contributing to making human rights education really transformative. We have a panel of eminent experts on the topic. They come from different background and professional and theoretical and disciplinary backgrounds. So we have both scholars of human rights education, practitioners from civil society, and practitioner that also can bring the perspective of students, so recent graduates from in human rights, so that have almost just completed a path in human rights education. And you have two moderators, so we expect to make it more interactive and not to bore you with all the institutional parts. So I give the floor to Lisa Heschl from the University of Graz, the UNESCO. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pietro, for the nice introduction. And thanks to all our panelists or roundtable discussants that you are here with us. With this roundtable discussion, what we wanted to show you is really the interdisciplinary character human rights education has to have in order to truly have an impact. So when we talk about human rights education, it should be relevant for students. It should be relevant to the lived experiences, to those who actually study and learn human rights. And it should be informed by the various perspectives, so by academics, by NGO activists, defenders, grassroots NGOs. And this is the purpose of this panel, to give really you an insight into this different perspectives. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first discussant, Felisa Tibbitts, who is a professor of international and European law at the University of Utrecht, and she is also the UNESCO chair in human rights and human rights higher education. Her research interests, or in her research, she focuses on human rights, global and democratic citizenship, education and education for sustainable development, curriculum policy and reform, critical pedagogy, and human rights in higher education transformation. And if you do your research on higher human rights education, you always come across her name when you Google publications. So we decided only to mention the latest one, which is together with Keith, about emancipatory human rights and the university, promoting social justice in higher education, which has been published by Routledge, the publishing house. So Felisa, thanks for being with us. Thanks for opening this discussion, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to join you. This is my first time here at the university, and it's been, of course, a really pleasant experience. I'm also really grateful that you made the effort to create a session focusing just on human rights education. Sometimes it's an element of human rights that's overlooked. And I think all of us maybe have experiences in our own organizations around that. So I'm grateful we have a chance and to be on this panel with all of you, to just have some open discussion about this key question about links between civil society organizations and university. I apologize in advance. I have a pretty heavy cold. So if this is the first time you're hearing me, this is not how I usually sound. It's a little croaky, but I'm going to do my best to sort of get through this presentation without having to do something like blow my nose or cough or what have you. Anyway, I'd like to begin actually on a personal note. Expert is a heavy term. I'm actually someone who is based in civil society. It was only 10 years ago that I migrated into higher education. So I'm actually someone who really, I think, thinks more from the civil society perspective. And I'd like to first begin by sharing with you on a personal note some of the things I brought into my teaching in higher education because of my experience running an NGO called Human Rights Education Associates, which by its name, you can tell that is exactly what it focused on. I think when you're working in a civil society organization doing human rights education, and those of us on the panel who are also still in civil society organizations know that you really have to do a good job because you're either fundraising with donors or you're asking people to pay for your courses. This means you have to always be thinking about having high quality trainings that are relevant for people's lives, creative pedagogy so people are engaged and motivated. And of course, if you're running a civil society organization offering human rights education and people are opting into your trainings, they're obviously really interested in human rights. So this sort of notion that human rights education should lead to motivation, capacity building, inclination to be involved in activist work, or at least working in solidarity with others doing activist work, is really central to the work. So I think the civil society field in HRE really helps to purify HRE in a way, keep us on target for thinking about organizing education and training in ways that have an impact on individuals and societies, not just information, and also allows us to bring some creative ideas into our teaching in higher ed. So for me specifically, I worked in higher education using what I call critical pedagogy, which is a kind of critical pedagogy is a term well known in education. Paulo Freire, the educational philosopher from Brazil, coined it. And if you've studied human rights education, you probably already know that critical pedagogy is the foundation, really the foundation of the methodological approaches to human rights education. And for myself, when I migrated into higher ed, having worked so long in civil society, I brought in techniques like values clarification, critical self-reflection, praxis, meaning actionable outcomes for my students in my classes. I worked with students' lived experiences, as Lisa already mentioned, promoted a democratic culture in the classroom, and I also very much wanted my students to connect with civil society organizations one way or another when they were taking classes, which I'll go into in just a couple of minutes. I also want to recognize before I talk go into my next topic that I think, for me anyway, it was important for me to acknowledge that many of my students, even though they signed up for my human rights education class, didn't necessarily self-identify their values as human rights values. In other words, they might see themselves as someone interested in social justice or anti-racism or feminism or decoloniality or peace. And for me, I would say openly to them, that is okay. I said, you know, it's important for you to understand the human rights system, because if you're interested in social change, there are tools in the human rights framework, especially legal ones, and notions of universal values that you can use as necessary in your advocacy work. But if you see yourself as a person interested in social justice, you know, feminism, so forth, perfectly fine. And I say that because some of us in the field of human rights education, and we're all very enthusiastic, otherwise we wouldn't be here, you know, we can be, students can be wary that we're going to proselytize in some way, that we're going to require them to agree with us and to take on the human rights framework. And my point of view on this is, of course, to offer it for it to be intrinsically motivating for students, but ultimately to recognize the agency of the students in deciding whether or not and how the human rights framework works for them in terms of their values and their activism. Okay, so the question that we were asked to address was in some way the values and challenges that civil society can bring in making human rights education in university truly transformative. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about transformative education. Transformative education. You see that a lot now in intergovernmental organization publications like UNESCO, but I think we have to it's a jargon. You know, we have to think, what is transformative learning? What is transformative education? Does it have to do with how we're teaching it? Does it have to do with the outcomes we're looking for? So I just want to propose some thinking around this. You might agree or disagree. What I would say is that in transformative education, change is the explicit goal. It's not forced change per se, of course, you can't force change, but natural changes in students' own thoughts and actions. And these modifications in students' thinking can result in other changes in their behaviors or lifestyles, et cetera. And transformative education is also linked up with the formal kind of definition of human rights education, which we find in the 2001 UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, which kind of really recognized for us what I would call is the gold standard of human rights education. And the gold standard of human rights education is education about human rights, meaning that it has to do with some of that core content. We know there's core legal content and normative content that's maybe human rights mechanisms, how they work. Very important for our learners to understand at least the basics of and feel comfortable in being positioned to learn more. So there's one part. Education through human rights is another element of the gold standard of HRE, means we do need to be thoughtful about pedagogy. How experiential or participatory it is, democratic culture and the learning environment, mutual respect between educators and students. So thinking about the message, the medium being the message itself as well. And this is a challenge actually in some instances when you are maybe say an instructor in a higher education institution, you're carrying out your human rights classes in a certain way, but other faculty or other elements of the university environment are less, say, human rights aligned or less of a human rights culture. We could talk about what that means. So it also raises larger questions about what does it mean if you're doing through human rights. You can talk about it for your classroom, but it is also, we as instructors in higher ed, does it challenge us to also think about working more widely in our universities to make them human rights aligned, human rights based approach, I would say. And the final kind of criteria for gold standard HRE is education for human rights, which is really, really important and distinguishes it from so many other things you can study in higher education. It means that there's going to be a residue of some kind when we teach human rights education, the minimum of which I think is an intrinsic interest and motivation to learn more. It could also mean some capacities to do something really tangible in supporting human rights, even if that's called social justice or feminism, but to be better positioned to do social change. So I want to just let you know, if you haven't seen it already, it's really a document worth looking at. Again, the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, which came out in 2011, has some of the best thinking of that time around what is human rights education, what are its aims, and who is responsible actually for carrying it out, which, by the way, because it's a UN document, is again putting the burden on governments. But as we know, those of us doing human rights education, the engine for human rights education has always been civil society historically. So transformation, I want to distinguish between personal transformation and social transformation. So one of the research I did in the past, which I learned so much from, was actually an impact evaluation of a Turkish women's human rights group that carried out non-formal education in human rights education. They linked up women's human rights with human rights education and training. It was a fantastic program, which I'm happy to talk more about in the discussion section if anyone is interested. But they worked with women who, in many cases, had experienced, human rights education, quote unquote, empowered them. And empowerment is, again, something you kind of have to break down. So for this particular research, we looked at things like valuing of before and after, pre-post, valuing of self, problem identification, confidence, courage, and some of these psychosocial elements, which are, I think, part of what we can see as part of transformation. Now, in a university classroom, I'm not arguing that this would necessarily be the aim. It might not necessarily be an outcome that you'd look for, but I do want to recognize that in terms of HRE and transformative ed, there is this personal domain, you know, and in a way it's like people, I think in peace education, even there was this frame that, you know, we can't make peace until we have peace inside of us. That's kind of cliche, but I just want to recognize that the transformative element of human rights education also has to do with oneself. So the psychosocial elements I mentioned, obviously, cognitively speaking, understanding of what are human rights and human rights mechanisms, and maybe very specific skills in terms how to act on human rights. And again, this will depend on where and how human rights education finds itself in a university setting. I, for example, have taught both in schools of education as well as arts and sciences. And in schools of education, the sort of the application, you know, the personal transformation and application maybe went into curriculum development a lot of the time. So that was very, very tangible. But working with students in arts and sciences, maybe majoring in human rights, the impacts were, in terms of how they were going to apply it, were not so clear. They were really very much, you know, determined by the students themselves. I have a little bit more on the pedagogy related to transformative education, but I think it might be a little bit more detailed, so I'm going to stop here. But we really actually have in the educational field, because I'm really, even though I was presented as being in the Department of International and Public Law, I actually trained in political science and worked primarily in education. So I see myself more as a pedagogue, if you will. And so I have, there is actually excellent research that's been done in adult learning around transformative education, how you can set it up so that learners become more aware of their values, are asked to think about their values critically, also in terms of maybe experience of discrimination they may have felt in the past, looking critically at society, and then maybe reframing their values and views of themselves in terms of their position in society and their agency to make change. So if you're interested, I can talk more about it. Societal transformation. So this is, again, part of my topic, what is transformative ed? Personal transformation and societal transformation. It probably goes without saying, if we're doing human rights education, this is about trying to improve society through, you know, through the values, of course, that human rights offers, even though those values can be conflicting and complex, and we have to discuss them still. We begin with this notion that it's about applying human rights values and the lenses in societies. So that means problem seeking through a human rights lens, doing a root cause analysis when we see problems, human rights problems in society, doing a root cause analysis to understand what creates those problems and how we can try to address them. Critiques of power, really important. I think in human rights education, if we want to lead to social transformation, we have to talk about power and who has it, and how we can try as a human rights activist to try to gain more power. And finally, how we can contribute to collective society-wide, local and global efforts to change human behavior systems and so forth. So personal and societal transformation. So the last part I want to talk about now is transformative education and civil society organizations. And again, I'm just kind of opening up a lot of topics because I think we're going to get into a lot with all the presenters here. And I trust that they're going to go into greater depth than I have in my presentation. So I do want to mention, first of all, that civil society organizations, of course, are not the same one to the other. So if you're in a university, you might be collaborating with a civil society organization that's a local community-based group focusing on neighborhood health and welfare. Or you could be working, you know, it could be a civil society organization like Amnesty International, which is cross-national campaigns and so forth. So it's just to acknowledge that CSOs are, you know, have different, they have different sizes and scopes. Some of them are explicitly human rights oriented, others are not. Some are really experienced in education and training, others are not. So it goes without saying, but those of us who are working in higher education, you know, we have to be very selective about how we work with civil society organizations and recognize, you know, what are the strengths they naturally bring to bear on our teaching, given their profiles, their focuses, and so forth. I also want to acknowledge that in many countries, in my experience anyway, university professors are often personally linked with civil society organizations. So it's not just kind of having institutional relationships. They might themselves have started an NGO, or they might, have very personal connections as an expert with civil society organizations. So this also creates a very interesting avenue for collaboration. The places inside of university where I think that NGOs can link to, and I'm almost finished now, and so this is, again, is opening up where those connections can happen. The first, of course, is in curriculum and teaching. So civil society organizations can offer learning resources that can be required or optional readings in courses that are taught pertinent to the areas of their own, the civil society work. They can be a guest speaker in your class. And what's really exciting about CSOs as guest speakers is they, speaking from their lived experiences, they're often talking about what it means to do human rights work, which is very motivating for students. And of course, if you can organize as an instructor final projects or other project work in your classes that can involve work with CSOs as clients, which is a way for your students also to get connected up with civil society organizations. Another way that NGOs can link with university spaces, of course, it's obvious, is to participate in events organized by the university or student clubs as experts, et cetera. They can also offer field work and internships, and I think community-based organizations or NGOs can also help in establishing research agendas for we who are university professors. Like what are the topics we choose to address? Can we learn from the struggles of community-based organizations or NGOs? Can we learn from the questions unanswered for them through our research? So I think that we should also recognize in our research capacities that we can benefit from understanding how we can contribute through research to improve programming and human rights education with NGOs. Two final points. Reciprocity matters. I think that NGOs are not just supposed to be obviously in the service of higher education institutions, and I think often from the higher education, it can feel like, oh, how can we bring in civil society organizations to help our students learn, to help us do our work better? But that's only unidirectional. So I think we in university also, just as a reminder to myself as well as others, we need to think about how we can also really assist NGOs and civil society organizations in their work. Again, that can be from asking them what kind of research we or our students could do that would be helpful for them, to really think about genuine reciprocity. In this book that Lisa mentioned, which was Emancipatory Human Rights in the University, we had a case study from South Africa where at Nelson Mandela University, there had been some professors that had associated themselves as researchers with a township project that was focusing on economic development. And it was not a successful collaboration, in part because the university professors had their own ideas about how they wanted to carry out research, what would count as really good evidence, and the agenda was essentially their own, and it just didn't work well with the township actors. And it was actually to the credit of the people who wrote this book chapter that they acknowledged that they hadn't really taken into account what true reciprocity would mean. So I just want to highlight that, if we work with civil society organizations, we need to sit and listen and hear how we can help them to succeed better. Second is that, of course, political context matters. We know this is obvious. Civil society organizations in some countries have more freedoms than others. We, as people interested in human rights, have more or less freedom in our own universities to talk about human rights. We may not be able, in some environments, and the political context is such that we can't talk about human rights explicitly in the university, but it's the civil society organizations that can do so. So I think, I hope that we bring out some of these nuances in our conversation today about these different political contexts and the opportunities and challenges they raise, both for universities and civil society organizations in doing human rights education. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to my colleagues' contributions and our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Felisa, for your input, for breaking down some key concepts, which will be very helpful for the type of discussion we are going to have, and also for sharing a lot of very helpful ideas as human rights educators ourselves to use in class, and also for starting to see how NGOs and academia can mutually reciprocally help each other in order to make human rights transformative at both the individual and the social level. Before going to the next speakers, I just need to apologize for a problem in the program. You will see there are 5 speakers, but unfortunately the 5th speaker couldn't make it. So of course we are not having contribution by Professor Cabezuda. And we now move to our second speaker, who is Professor Corinne Lennox. She is the co-director of the Human Rights Consortium, University of London. She's a reader in human rights, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and the convener of the master degree program in human rights there. She has multiple research focus, including human rights education, but most of her research deal with minority rights issues, indigenous right protection, civil society mobilization for human rights, and human rights and development. She's been a human rights consultant for several international institutes, including an organization, including Minority Rights Group International, the United Nations Development Program, and the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And publication, we have a huge list. The one we want to most relevant is Transnational Social Mobilization and Minority Rights, which was published by Routledge a couple of years ago. Corinne, thank you for accepting our invitation to join this roundtable. You now have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pietro. And I'm really delighted and thrilled that I've been invited to be on this panel. And it's so exciting to hear from my fellow speakers. And I look forward to hearing from you as students in the audience, students of human rights education, and also my fellow practitioners of human rights education. I think we have an exciting exchange ahead of us. So today, I hopefully I'm going to take from where Felisa has left us off, because I want to do a deeper dive into how do universities work with civil society in the classroom. And I've chosen to focus my talk specifically on the use of activist pedagogies, by which I mean using activist knowledge and knowledge exchange as a transformative pedagogy of human rights in universities, human rights education in universities. And I want to share some personal reflections on how I use this. And just briefly, in the classroom, we use activist pedagogy in terms of inviting speakers into the classroom, which Felisa mentioned. I lead an online program to a distance learning MA. So we have a lot of video interviews with practitioners that students can watch. We also have asynchronous online discussions with human rights practitioners, and a lot of learning resources produced by human rights practitioners that we share. And I was also interested in this because, as a plug, I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Human Rights Practice, which I encourage you all to read. It is a fantastic journal focusing on promoting the knowledge that human rights activists have and the knowledge that we get from practice of human rights. So do have a look. But we have an upcoming special issue on activist pedagogy and human rights. Actually, we're meeting next week with some contributors about that. So I look forward to hopefully sharing some learning from this with that next engagement. So in preparing for my talk today, I was reflecting on my own personal experience as a student in human rights education, which I'm almost embarrassed to say started 30 years ago to this day, where I started in an undergraduate minor program in international justice and human rights. It's interesting when Felisa said this point about we don't always come to this through the lens of human rights. The university was quite particular in saying it should be international justice and human rights, so that we think of this in beyond only the human rights framework. And then I went on to do a master's degree in the theory and practice of human rights at the University of Essex with one of my colleagues, who's still my colleague to this day. So those of you who are students, look around, because you still be working with these people in 30 years' time. And the reflection I had in both those experiences that we didn't often or at all have activists in the classroom speaking to us as part of our day-to-day learning, right? There was lots of extracurricular events that our teachers organized for us, So there were opportunities to learn from activists, but it wasn't necessarily part of our regular curriculum, that opportunity. And that's why I think that's something significant that has changed. So when I came to my current job, which is at the University of London, I was charged with leading a module called Securing Human Rights. And just to acknowledge, my predecessor in that role was Anja Melchiori, who's a former staff of this institution, has been a really important leader in human rights education. So I stood on her shoulders in taking on that module. But that module was built entirely around activist pedagogy. It was only built around creating spaces for activists to come in the classroom and talk about their experiences with students. So that for me was a steep learning curve in terms of how do I address this pedagogically? How do I support students to really make the most of this really important opportunity? So I want to frame my talk around 3 key questions that relate to activist pedagogy. So what is the value of activist knowledge exchange for students? What is the value of activist knowledge exchange for activists? And how can activist knowledge be shared successfully in university human rights education? So on the first question, what is the value of activist knowledge exchange for students? So this is sort of drawn based on my own observations about how students use that as a learning opportunity. And the first thing, of course, is that students can hear firsthand the opportunities and the faults in the human rights system, right? So how do activists navigate this space? So how do they connect international advocacy work in the UN with local level activism? Students are learning about the UN, which maybe seem very abstract. And then they can hear from activists, really, how do they practically use that? Why is it important to them to have that space? So it makes it less abstract, I would say. They can learn about how activists vernacularize human rights to different contexts and themes. So again, students are learning about these universal treaties, soft law, different movement discourse and jargon at the international level, but how can they bring that back to their own work, to their own cultural and political context, and they can learn how activists do that. Of course, they can also hear the very latest developments in the field because the activist is going to talking about what they've been doing that week. And, for me as a teacher, I just cannot have that depth of knowledge across a range of issues that an activist can have, and nor do the learning resources necessarily keep up with the latest developments. And I think it also enables students in the interaction to share their own interpretations of rights from their own contexts, from their own lived experience, both with the practitioner, as a peer, but also with their fellow peers as students in that discussion that flows from that. Because most of our students are also activists in some way, shape, or form, and I'm sure that's true for all of you as well. And so this includes being able to ask practitioners questions about issues that the students as practitioners are wrestling with in their own human rights work. And I think that's been an important opportunity to enable students to reflect critically on their own practice in human rights work with practitioners. Importantly, practitioners teach them about resilience. I mean, this comes up so often in the discussions with practitioners. It is hard to be a human rights activist, and students want to know what are the coping mechanisms that human rights activists use to keep going in a very difficult work environment. Of course, it's a networking opportunity for students. Students also often use it as an opportunity to talk about career paths, for example. And we also make use of our alumni, often inviting alumni back to teach as activist practitioners. So for our students coming back, it's an interesting experience to reflect on how far they've come from their learning, or how their learning really impacted on the work that they do now, what they benefited from their study time with us. So I think that's an important benefit for them as alumni and students. So the second question is, what is the value of activist knowledge exchange for activists? So thinking of Felisa's point about reciprocity. So I think the first thing, a reflection I have on this, is that the activists can benefit from the challenging questions that you as students ask them, and it really gives them a motive and an opportunity for self-reflection. Activists are very time poor, and so the kind of self-reflection that they get to do in that opportunity of speaking with students is really important for their own practice, but also for their own well-being, I would say. So let me give you an example from this term. So we had a student asked our guest practitioner, quote, "Over your longstanding career, what has been the most impactful lesson you've learned from working with marginalized women and communities? How has this lesson shaped your approach to advocacy and the work you continue to do each day? And interesting, this particular student said for himself, he said, learning from others' experiences helps me stay motivated and focused in his own work with marginalized communities. And in response, our guest practitioner was able to draw on lessons from her own work, also for her critical self-reflection. And she said, quote, and this, she's given an example, and then she said, quote, this lesson has transformed my approach to advocacy. It has made me more conscious of the power dynamics that often exist within movements themselves. Too often the voices of the most marginalized are drowned out by those with privilege, even within social justice spaces, end quote. And she's a practitioner based in the Global South, and the student was a practitioner based in the Global North. But I think they found some common ground here in thinking through power structures, thinking through the impact on grassroots engagement with marginalized groups. And then the guest practitioner went on to say, quote, so my suggestion to you, the student, as someone working with marginalized communities, is to remain steadfast in your commitment to those at the margins. Listen to them, learn from them, and let them lead. Their knowledge, strength, and resistance are the most powerful tools we have for dismantling these oppressive systems. And no matter how difficult it gets, know that you are part of a global movement for justice. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, is a step forward. It's such a powerful statement. And I think for her, it's also a reminder for her of being part of that global movement, right? So you had the opportunity to reflect on that with the student. The second point here is under, is practitioners also engage in knowledge exchange from students, but they also learn from these experiences themselves. So it is a two-way, it is an exchange of knowledge, I would say. So many students share their experiences as activists with guest practitioners. In another recent example, a student shared her frustration of international women's advocacy that has sidelined the voices of women. This was in the women, peace, and security arena. And she illustrated with an example from her own work in Sudan. And she asked the guest practitioner, what strategies are most effective for securing access to international platforms for marginalized women's rights activists? And our guest practitioner, who's from India, replied that with some deep reflections on her work from that context, but then she concluded with the words, quote, I am deeply inspired by your reflections and your commitment to Sudanese women, and I truly believe that by continuing to support each other and build collective power, we will make the global stage a more equitable space for all marginalized women. So she was taking inspiration from the students' example as well. And in that same session, we had another student who was working with a different group within this global movement that our guest practitioner was part of, and was really questioning and sort of challenging the guest practitioner. What can you do more to support this community that is not so visible in your movement? So I think activists can also be challenged on their own practice in these exchanges, right, with students who challenge them on that. Practitioners also get some perspective on the value of the knowledge that they hold. And I think their lived experience is so rich. They have gained important insights on how to do things, on what failure looks like, practical knowledge on systems and structures that just might not be written down anywhere. So who else is going to tell you that the best way to do diplomatic advocacy at the UN is to sit in the cafe and talk, have a coffee with the diplomat and give them information that they want to hear, right? This is not written down, but this is the knowledge that activists have in their head, right? And so I think they can really, you can share knowledge. It's just not readily available in other learning materials that we could provide. And then practitioners also get the opportunity to share knowledge on what not to do, right? So as I said, they know what failure looks like. They have their own hard lessons learned. And they've all witnessed bad practice in human rights movements. And so they get a genuine opportunity to inform students on what not to do and how to make human rights activism more transformative, more ethical, more impactful. And I think for them, having an audience like there is here, it's like such a valuable opportunity to transfer that wisdom, right? And to make a plea to do things better, right? To learn from our mistakes, to do things better in the future. And I think the university in particular is an appropriate space for that conversation, for that dialectic, which you can't always even have within your own organization, frankly. So the university provides that space to learn from past mistakes and to think through new ways of doing things. So the third part and the final part is how can activist knowledge be shared successfully in university human rights education? The first thought I had on this was that we really need to set the groundwork for a decolonial approach to knowledge exchange. So this starts with an understanding of epistemic justice and epistemic injustice, right? And so critiquing forms of knowledge, critiquing hierarchies of knowledge, ensuring that curricula reflect what De Souza Santos calls epistemologies of the South, ensuring that there is a place in your curriculum for subaltern knowledge and valuing that. And this is really exposing students to these different threads of critical thinking and teaching them to value different forms of knowledge and to seek out different forms of knowledge. And part of that is looking also at structures of power in which human rights work occurs, of course, looking at global north, global south structures, but race, class, gender, a decolonial understanding of human rights. And I think this helps to have a critical perspective on the human rights movement and project itself. And then finally, structures of power within social mobilization for human rights. That the power inequalities exist between NGOs, that we have to have critiques of CSO accountability. That's absolutely a big part of our curriculum. And understanding our own positionality as human rights defenders within movements. And I think that helps students to reflect on their own place in social mobilization and how they can take a human rights approach to that. The second point here is activists are not just in civil society organizations. So I've interpreted activists broadly in terms of who I invite into the classroom. So invite people from national human rights institutions, from UN agencies, diplomats. So I think it's important to have a wider view of who constitutes actors within the human rights movement and who's a practitioner. Activists don't always recognize how valuable their knowledge is, and they don't have that many platforms to share their knowledge. So I think in a university setting it can also be an intimidating place in which to speak for practitioners. And so it helps to convey to them the kind of knowledge that students would find useful. And I usually encourage them to do a case study or two to try and as a kind of method for supporting students' learning. But we always, of course, leave time for questions because what you want to learn is important from the student audience. And I remember on one occasion I had a guest speaker who had worked for many years with different NGOs on protecting human rights defenders in different formats. And he had to reflect on that in the lecture. And I said, have you ever written this down? And he said, oh, no, actually, I haven't. I'm like, oh my God, this is so important knowledge you have. And what he ended up doing was writing some journal articles, a special issue. So that kind of flowed from that he had an opportunity, was encouraged from that exchange to really value the knowledge he had and to share it. We have to safeguard activists to be able to share knowledge. It's not without its risks for many activists coming into the classroom. I have many students who live in authoritarian contexts, so it's not without risk for them to have this exchange as well. So we need to take some precautions. We need to assess risk in consultation with activists and to support students to be able to exercise their academic freedom. And the final point, we can build student confidence to engage with activists. So I think some students can be intimidated to ask questions. I mean, that's completely normal. You're learning, maybe you don't feel confident to ask questions of an expert. So we have to focus as teachers on scaffolding as a pedagogical approach to really build your capacity to have a more productive exchange with activists, to be able to ask those critical questions confidently. And that means, for me, as a teacher, setting readings that in advance or learning resources that will help you to do that. But, creating a curriculum that enables you to grapple with these big picture issues, understanding key actors and structures in human rights, key theoretical approaches. And I also encourage students to contact the activists afterwards, right? So sometimes in the classroom, it's a bit intimidating to ask questions. So I say, approach them. Sometimes they approach them for career purposes, sometimes just for mentorship or actually asking questions about activism that they're involved in. And that's tended to be a very productive learning opportunity that can continue outside the classroom. So I'll conclude there and look forward to hearing some other examples from folks.
So thank you very much, Corinne, for your insights into how you actually integrate activism and activists in your teaching at the university, which leads us straight to actually our activists at the panel. And I'm happy to introduce to you Stasya Denisova, who is a human rights defender from Russia. She's the human rights education team lead for Europe and Central Asia at Amnesty International. And her expertise in human rights and international human rights law includes forced migrants, survivors of modern slavery and violent hate crimes. So it is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. And we are very looking forward about your experiences with with human rights education.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm very grateful, but also very humbled to be speaking at this highly esteemed conference to you, such a great audience. I remember Pietro emailing me and saying, "Dear Dr. Denisova," and I was like, "I'm not a doctor. Are you sure you're inviting me?" And then he said, "Apologies, dear Professor Denisova." Not even that. But I hope I'm the right Denisova to be invited. So anyway, I'm looking forward to sharing, to building in somewhat on what both panelists said, but also speaking about something else. So I will definitely build on what Felisa said. Human rights education, in human rights education, political context matters. So I will definitely go deeper into that. And on what Corinne mentioned as resilience and how we can build resilience to continue teaching about human rights in very difficult countries, contexts, environments where it can be deadly. So as I was presented, I come from Russia, where I worked in human rights organizations starting from 2002 to 2017. And since then, I've been with Amnesty International working on human rights education in Europe, where we have 26 sections or offices, and I'm helping our sections to align their human rights education programs with our regional or global priorities. But practically, is it too loud? But practically, I work alongside teachers, human rights defenders, activists in non-section countries, meaning Belarus, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, South Caucasus, where we try to integrate human rights education into schools. So I'm not going to speak a lot about universities, but more about non-formal education and education in schools. So at the same time, I have to make the disclaimer that these are my views only and do not necessarily reflect Amnesty position or policy. Which is a pity, but yeah, that's how it is. So today I will be sharing some thoughts on the topic, and I've broken it down to 3 questions. I will speak about the main challenges facing civil societies that I'm working with. I will also highlight the unique values that civil societies can and do bring into human rights education, and also how these added values make human rights education or can make it genuinely transformative. So what are the main challenges in the part of the world that I'm more proactively working on? In Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, Central Asia, and it's common knowledge, you know, that there is a huge rise of authoritarianism. And when I'm saying that, I mean the rise of overwhelming state power over people's power, where human rights defenders, NGOs, activists, journalists, bloggers facing criminal charges for critical posts, articles, lectures, peaceful demonstrations, and what's not. Ales Bialiatski, one of the 3 Nobel Peace Prize winners of 2022 from Belarus, even called it a new, instead of the Communist International, the new Dictatorships International that is being coined. And indeed, my Amnesty colleagues working in the Americas, MENA region, Africa, report the similar rise of authoritarianism spreading in those parts of the world too. But I'll focus on my region and try to look beyond the symptoms and the possible cause of it from my humble perspective. So the first symptom of this authoritarian shift is well known as well. This is the dismissal of human rights as a concept and as a Western concept that supposedly contradicts local societies and traditional values. This makes our work so hard. The narrative is especially prominent in Russia, Belarus, most of the post-Soviet space, including all the countries that I've mentioned, but not only. It is in the Western Balkans, Bulgaria, Turkey, and others. So the second symptom that of authoritarianism that is making the work dangerous is the demonization of civil society through foreign agents legislation. And this legislation allegedly implies that human rights are purely under the control of foreign powers. So I was born in the USSR, and I grew up in the follow-up of Gorbachev's perestroika. Maybe you've heard about that, with its poverty, but also with its freedom for innovation, a lot of foreign exchanges, popularity of human rights. But then in the beginning of the millennium, when starting from 2008, 2010, we all could see as a Russian civil society, step by step, the building of the vertical of power, as it was called officially. And that vertical of power started from getting rid of governors' elections, criminal prosecutions of activists, including myself, for any criticism of authorities. And then in 2012, they brought this foreign agents legislation that I've mentioned. And this is such a dangerous tool that's been rolling out since then and literally dismantling civil society in Russia. Again, the same Ales Bialiatski called it the scorched earth in Russia now, in terms of how destructive it was. The recent European Court decision, Kabale against Russia, summarized the complaints of 140 NGOs, activists, groups who complained against this legislation. And it shows how contagious this formula is. So basically, you just have to do some political work, very loosely defined. Even human rights education is political work, according to this legislation. And you have to have some funding, foreign funding, even 1 ruble of donation. And that's enough for you to become a foreign agent in Russia and be fined or be criminally prosecuted if you do not abide by the law. And the court found that this is a violation of the right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of private life, because now foreign agents are also individuals. So it is, it went to great extent. Even the famous and maybe largest human rights organization Memorial in Russia was recognized as a foreign agent. And this was an NGO that keeps the memory of past repressions, of Stalin's repressions, Gulag repressions. So basically, this is a clear message by the country that past repressions were justified, and thus modern repressions are also fine. So the most worrying thing in our work is that this copy of the Russia foreign agents legislation has since been adopted in Hungary, 2017, Kyrgyzstan, 2023, Georgia, 2014, just to name a few. And the similar bill is currently under review in the Parliament of Slovakia and Turkey. So these two, I call them symptoms of rising authoritarian, whatever you like them, hallmarks, are already so damaging for civil societies that maybe that's enough to start looking for the cause of it. So what went wrong, that it is increasingly difficult to work on human rights, even on human rights education, which is a little bit more vegetarian, I would say, way of working in comparison to research and campaigning that we do. So in my view, the swing of this global pendulum from democracies to human rights to authoritarianism and anti-rights could be rooted in 1948 discussions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm sure you know that the main debate was there if human rights are above sovereignty or sovereignty is above human rights. And the representative of France said that, and this is not a quote, just my summary, that it's necessary to reconsider the concept of state sovereignty. So Hitler proclaimed absolute sovereignty, calling the state the sole master of its own house. This stance led first to human rights violations against the German people, and then to crimes against human rights in other countries, and eventually to a world war. So human rights must take precedence over sovereignty. But maybe you know that the Soviet Union stated an opposite position. They said, in bearing sovereignty, we can just as easily bury the state itself. Propaganda against state sovereignty is an ideological preparation for a country's political capitulation to a more powerful state. And the principle of sovereignty is the only protection weaker countries have against the expansionist ambitions of stronger states. And so the three representatives of USSR abstained in the vote of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thus, so they didn't vote against, but they didn't vote for. And so this was a shaky consensus from the beginning, I would say. And I think we're bearing the fruits of that reluctance of the Soviet states to agree that human rights are above sovereignty. And that's where the rhetoric, the narrative that Russia is using now, saying that we support the sovereignty of weaker states. And this resonates very well with the audiences of the global South. But it, yeah, so Russia even says that they are decolonizing the world, which is popular in Africa, popular in many regions of the world, because of the fatigue of some countries feel from being colonized by the West, but it's not resonating with the countries there, USSR or the Imperial Russia colonized previously. So this unresolved matter, I think, is indeed the underlying cause behind the symptoms that we need to be able to articulate now anew during our human rights education courses. So human rights are above sovereignty after all, and why? And make it really powerful. It's not a given. It's something that is being contested every day. So what value can civil society bring into human rights education? In my opinion, we still, aside from everything that has been said, we have one powerful thing that civil societies can still bring, given this contention of the core thing about human rights. And that is the resilience of Russian, Belarus, and Ukrainian civil societies in what is going on now in this full-scale aggression against Ukraine. If there is this one healing agent that could promote this recovery from authoritarianism, it's this. So we shall echo this France representative's position, which was announced in the General Assembly in 2048, as far as that, proving it with fresh evidence of this current war in Ukraine. In that historic UN gathering, the world, still reeling from the aftermaths of the Second World War, made a clear statement. So when we allow dictators to dismantle local civil society, there is no one left to keep power at check. And when there is no one left inside the country to keep power in check, then this dictator will inevitably go beyond its own borders. As simple as that. So keeping now saying that's what happened in Nazi Germany, that's what we're seeing is happening in Putin's Russia. And I'm saying it as a failed representative of a failed Russian civil society who couldn't take that power in check because power was enormous. And we also couldn't keep it alone. And this is another message that this is only possible when there is international solidarity. And so this unique value of civil society, their understanding of how it all came about, that started with the destruction of civil society in Russia, that lack of international solidarity during, after, in the middle of the foreign agents legislation and that bulldozer that went in it. These are the lessons learned that led us, in my opinion, to this war and to this evidence that human rights should be above sovereignty, because it works like that. It does. And this message also started to emerge very clearly in the Nobel Peace Prize winner speeches in 2022. So the second Nobel Prize winner was Alexandra Matvichuk from Ukraine Center for Civil Liberties. And she echoed Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel laureate 1975, who said, "Peace, progress, human rights are inextricably linked. The state that kills journalists, imprisons activists, disperses peaceful demonstrations, poses a threat not only to its citizens, but to the entire world, and peace in the entire world as a whole." So I think this is the unique value of three civil societies, of three countries that we need to tap into in order to keep human rights afloat. And finally, how these added values make human rights education genuinely transformative. So I think, firstly, the primary remedy we all need to do, whether we work with schools, universities, non-formal spaces, so we need to retell the story of human rights in a powerful way through the lens of peace, amplified by the Ukraine example. And then we also need to localize human rights education. And I know that Dr. Yasmin Lilian Diab yesterday, one of the panels referred to the word localize as one of the buzzwords that is being used by many international NGOs. But she also said that this is the correct buzzword. So localizing is on a deeper level. So just to give you an example of trainings that we do together with teachers and human rights defenders from Kyrgyzstan, we look into values that underpin human rights, like freedom, like equality, or justice. And then we look to get, are they foreign? How close are they to your life, culture, history? And then we have fascinating discoveries together when they say, no, you know, we have in Kyrgyzstan the tradition of akyns. These are singers who, since time immemorial, they sing to criticize the powerful ones in songs, in public spaces. So this akyns, to them, is the has served as a voice of justice and freedom of expression since long time ago in the Kyrgyz culture. They say, for us, this is the justice and the freedom. They also explore historical role models like women leaders like Kurmanjan Datka in Kyrgyzstan, who challenged patriarchal norms and exemplified the traditionally sourced potential for gender equality and women power, and saying, no, this gender equality is actually super traditional for Kyrgyzstan. We can draw on that example of that powerful woman who gathered together our nomadic peoples long time ago. So that is what I say, what means localize, not just translate adequately, do a bottom-up approach, but as deep as the values. And I think also that is what probably Dr. Thomas Davis referred to in his panel speech, saying the value power. So for me, it is the power that we need to tap into. And this value-based human rights education should come in before the norms, mechanisms, institutions. Because if we take away the value, which is contested, then the norms and mechanisms and institution will crumble very quickly and are crumbling. Secondly or thirdly, human rights education to be genuinely transformative must lead to action. And this is something that Felisa has been talking about as well a lot. So we need to ignite the mobilizing force of human rights education to demonstrate that people power works. So no matter how overwhelming state power is becoming in many states, people power still works, and Amnesty's traditionally been doing it around people's cases. So in our global campaigns, we mobilize people around 10 global cases every year in the campaign called Right for Rights on the 10th of December. And then we come back to these cases to show where this people power worked. And we have amazing examples. For example, Sasha Skrychelenko, from an artist, anti-war artist from Russia, who was included into prison exchange with the West-East this year, just because she was the only activist in the list of prominent politicians, just because of a huge world global action to support her, so loud that she was the only one included, and she is free now. Being able to draw and not to sit in prison. So action, lead to action, and show that this action works. And finally, maybe it's already enough. Do you have, how many? 1 minute, okay. Then I'll summarize. So I believe that these combined treatments, so learning new lessons from joint failures in allowing Russia's aggression against Ukraine, localizing value-based human rights education, and activating people power can strengthen our communities, equipping them to resist this authoritarianism, protect human rights as the foundation for peace, and so that we finally can live in the world where no one is left alone facing leviathans.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stasya, for your contribution. And you added a lot of very interesting insights into the discussion, including, well, human rights education in school and non-formal education, which was just mentioned before. Also the idea of human rights education in an increasingly shrinking civic space, so also linking to yesterday debates. And of course, the debate about human rights and sovereignty is central and very much, I think, related to the idea of considering the political context and to be critical about power when we deal with human rights. Thank you also for the example of resilience and of localizing, as you said, value-based human rights education, and also for maybe some sort of prioritization about the three elements of human rights education, no? About through, maybe through is even coming before about is the last part, when in many cases human rights education is mostly about human rights rather than being the other part. So we move to our last but not least, of course, speaker, Mrs. Christine Nanteza. She is a non-profit consultant, more than 11 years of experience in the human rights field. She studied in University of Waterloo, Canada, psychology and economics, and she graduated in human rights and multi-level governance at this university. She is an alumni of this specific human rights education program. She has excelled in the organization of several initiatives, and I would like to mention in particular one initiative that very much resonates with what was said at the beginning, especially by Felisa, that is the student engagement team, which is a student-led project that helped to create a space where human rights can be shared and discussed, also helping faculty to improve the programs and to better help students in that. And I just want to add, because this was also emulated to some extent, and we have other student-led initiative, including the Advocacy Hub that was created a few months ago, that is again another student-led initiative about seminar for students. So the role model of the set took about the students' body. So Christine, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You have the floor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Everyone's been fantastic and brilliant. Before I start, I'm just gonna ask y'all to stand up, stretch a bit. I feel tense, so we're just gonna stretch for a minute. Do not leave, I can see you, while I sort out some slides. Okay, so I think you've done a great job of inviting folks to this panel who have similar chains of thought. And I'm going to talk about an individual perspective to everything we've been talking about, what it looks like to be on the front lines of a crisis of people dying constantly and policies not changing, to support the work that nonprofits are doing. This is my personal experience. Certain points are quite intense, so if I get emotional, bear with me. But yeah, let's get into it. So I titled it this way because I was thinking about the gravity of what we're asking y'all to engage in. It's not just about doing a program, it's about going out there and then using that knowledge. And it sometimes is difficult, emotionally, physically, financially, it's difficult. So just think about what it means for you if you decide to take this path and how difficult it can be and the resilience and the commitment it requires to keep doing the work in the field, just like you said. Yeah. So this presentation is going to discuss some traumatic events, but it's not limited to violence, abuse, and loss. The content may be distressing. If you do feel that you need a break or you're triggered, please get up and take the time and take care of yourself. So I'm gonna preface by talking about how I view problems and the development of solutions, and that it's based on my identity as a Black woman, obviously, but also as an immigrant to Canada, to Italy, from East Africa, born in East Africa, to a middle-class dual-parent household. I spent the last decade working in civil society organizations, like they said, and I wanted to understand how public policy and specifically social welfare policy affects how social services are provided to people in need. So a lot of my youth and my adult socialization has taken place in Canada, and that's the experience that forms the lens through which I analyze problems, I analyze human rights. Of course, they mentioned already, but I studied psychology and economics at Waterloo, that's in Canada, and then I came here and I did human rights and multi-level governance. And while I was at university, I joined a multitude of different groups. I love everything. If there was an engineering group that was about acting and making plays about engineering, I would probably join it because I basically enjoy learning about different things. So I joined different groups. And in between my degrees, so the bachelor's and the master's, I decided to, feed my curiosity and then see how I could apply the knowledge I had acquired. So I did it in my bachelor's, I left, I went somewhere else to see how I can apply that knowledge. Then I did it after the master's degree program because I wanted to see the practicality of what we were learning and if it really does match what I'm reading in books and stuff. So I went to Uganda, which is where I'm born, and I started a peer-to-peer literacy group. So I'm gonna play the video from that group. Of course, these children were asked and their parents provided consent to record them. Please do not record the recording because I don't want to share it out to the public, but it was just to document their journey for themselves.
Hello, my name is Catharina. I'm Christy. We have been part of our future our responsibility for 7 months. In this program, we learn how to use computer applications like Microsoft Word, Paint, and PowerPoint. Then we made presentations of what we have been learning. I have learned how to type. It has helped me to research things what I don't know, like typing and practicing letter writing. It has helped me to improve in my language. I have learned how to type, so if my mom doesn't have money,
We lived close to it and we lived fairly well. And across the street was this destitute poverty that made no sense to me. We're fine. And across the street, these kids can't even live in a decent house. Like it would flood in their house and they would have to cook in the flood, in the sewage. It was just unfathomable. So I thought maybe they can come and be exposed to something different. So I started this group and those are the children that were in it. But what I did not anticipate is how difficult it would be to sustain it. I was living between Uganda and Canada, and that's extremely expensive, of course, but also quite difficult to go back and forth and also create some sort of life for myself while doing this, right? So these children were between the ages of 7 and 15. And as we continued through the cycles of the project or the mini program, I learned things about their lives, that they, again, lived in dire poverty. Some had experienced sexual abuse that led to teen pregnancy, which again, I did not have the capacity to deal with things like this. And their mother was a single mother and she was not very supportive in this situation. So when I left, I decided to move back to Canada, and I ended up working for the City of Calgary After School Program, which you see up on the screen there. And again, I worked with children from low-income families who needed some kind of support after school. But again, you see the same kind of issues, right? They don't necessarily complete high school, teen pregnancy, a lot of violence, especially with Indigenous children. They have a lot of trauma from their communities and they end up in the system, end up incarcerated. And those are heavy things to deal with because you want to help, but you don't have the tools or the capacity to help. And I think I heard something about Indigenous ways of learning and Indigenous ways of working and trying to transpose my way of knowing into a child's life does not make sense when they have their own culture that's not respected in a country that I'm an immigrant in. It's very disrespectful to say the least, right? So the next one is another video of another organization that I worked for part-time while I was working for the City of Calgary. And this is called Calgary Alpha House Society. I'm just gonna play a video about what they do. Lucky for me, there is no sound, so just read it while I speak. So what they do is they help people dealing with addictions, mental health, and homelessness. Up there, what you're seeing is how they define the continuum of homelessness to try and educate society about the issue. So I was introduced to Alberta's public health policies through this organization. And these are policies, drug policies, and they differ from, province to province. I was in Alberta, but what we get from Ontario is different, Quebec is different, BC's, British Columbia is different, and that's problematic when you're trying to deal with a national crisis when each province deals with it differently. So I'll show you how some of the provinces, have built up or developed their drug policies or what they call their drug policies, and then maybe try and see how that can be problematic for organizations trying to collaborate across those provincial borders. So yeah, so what you're seeing here is what it means to work in spaces like this. So studies show that although support workers do derive fulfillment, and they refer to it as compassion satisfaction, so that's fulfillment and pleasure from the work that we do, we do also experience a lot of burnout. There's a lot of primary and secondary trauma, and it's experienced at higher rates than the general population. And this was also pronounced during the COVID crisis. So after I left all my jobs, because I like to do multiple jobs, so after I left these jobs, I moved on to come here to Padova to do this master's degree program. And when I got back to Canada, we were in the middle, of a public health crisis after COVID, and it had turned into a full-blown emergency around drug poisonings and what that has done to communities across Canada. I'm not gonna play those videos for you because they're quite daunting and traumatic, but it's quite bad, and there are parts of the country, for example, in Vancouver, East Hastings, it's like zombie town. Like they're not, people don't go there anymore. It's just a dead zone of people who are just enthralled in this crisis. And the people who work in those spaces deal with a lot of trauma, and they deal with a lot of changing legislation that's difficult to reconcile with what they're doing. So this organization that I worked with when I got back to Alberta was called Aware, and they are a group or a collective of people who use drugs, who advocate for harm reduction, destigmatization, and dignity for people who are dealing with addictions and homelessness. So it's people with lived experience helping people who are living the experience. It's a different way of doing this work. Previously, it's been, again, practitioners telling people who are experiencing it what to do, and then this was incorporated in a greater scope, and Aware has been at the front lines of that. So I was the director of programs there, and I was overseeing employment and reintegration initiatives for people with a history of addiction. And I worked closely with organizational partners, hospitals, foundations, legislators, and researchers to develop programs that influence drug policy in Canada. One of our biggest accomplishments is what you're seeing there. We called it the drug chicken. Someone came up with a chicken because it sounded like checking, and a little joke in the office, but we came up with drug checking. And it was the first drug checking program in Alberta that was federally funded. And some of the politics in Canada is that Alberta and the federal government do not mix. So there's a lot of play on what they fund to try and gain political support. So the federal government funded this, but the provincial government was extremely against this. So they would have police cracking down on what we were doing. We needed an exemption. It takes years to get these sorts of things. They expire. So it's hard to provide services that folks need in this kind of political climate. So I was reflecting on the theme of the conference. I called Pietro a few times because I was kind of stuck on what to do. I scraped the entire presentation this morning and I redid it because I was trying to figure out how to bring something of value to you to take away from this. And I reflected on the question. So I decided to focus on one specific area of that question. It's the unity across borders. And looking at the obstacles that hinder civil society actors from uniting across borders to develop human rights standards and support the monitoring and recovery work of international organisms. So again, I'm looking at it from the individual perspective, not the communal collective perspective, because I think change begins, we might all agree, change begins with an individual, okay? So it's great that we talk in a collective way, but with collectives, people weave in and out. You have your own motivations, other people come in, other people leave, but you need to understand why you're doing it, why you want to continue doing it. Otherwise, the collective structure might crumble. So I want to appeal to your individual motivations for getting into this area. So from my experience, let's see where. So these are just, again, I'm just going to go back a little bit. These are just different ways that different provinces describe these policies in Canada. Ontario calls it an opioid strategy. The Canadian federal government doesn't even give any specific legislation. It has a strategy, but kind of guidelines. Then you have Alberta talking about a recovery model, which has to do with treatment. And again, they want to have people in treatment against their will. You can say what you want about human rights in that area. And then you have British Columbia that decriminalized completely. So the landscape there looks completely different from the one in Alberta, but somehow we have to work together and we're neighbors, right? So it's quite difficult to do this work. So again, I'm gonna tell you a story from a personal experience. It's hopefully doesn't trigger anyone, but it's a bit of a traumatic experience for me. So it was a situation where I worked for Aware in permanent supportive housing and also the shelter side of it. So shelter is emergency, immediate, you stay for a night, you leave. Permanent supportive housing is a space where people who are dealing with chronic issues will get housed so that they're not out on the street. So this is the housing first approach, housing first philosophy that AWARE applies to their work. So I was at work behind the reception area desk, sort of this high, and there was a client altercation. There was the aggressor, and then there was the victim of the aggression. And my supervisor thought it would be great to have the aggressor locked in a kind of boxed off area, closed all the doors, and I was behind the desk this way. So we're closed in together, but I have this desk protecting me. And then they brought the victim around the side to my side for some reason. I did not anticipate, and I'm pretty sure they did not see this coming, but the aggressor jumped over the counter. So here I am, stuck with this aggressive person, violent past, being looked up, being searched for by the police, behind here with me. I can't get through, I can't get away, and I'm stuck with the victim. My first response, instead of trying to protect myself, was to jump in between them and try and protect the victim. I didn't get hurt, thank God. Somehow found the energy to keep a barrier between us and wasn't hurt. But when I reflected on the experience, and I often reflected on these experiences when I would get home, sitting in the bathtub, crying because it's a lot to deal with, I wondered why I decided to protect this person that I don't know instead of protecting myself. We're trained to protect us first, yourself first, and then you deal with the situation. That's the training they give us. But my instinct was to protect this person. So then as I reflected, I realized I have this sense of duty that I cannot be resolved of. I'm stuck, I call it a burden. I'm stuck with this burden where I feel that I have to do something. If I can, I must. So, and I'm not sure if it's a calling for a lot of people that do this work, but I think deep down it is a calling. If you can, you must. You cannot sleep at night knowing that you did nothing. So a lot of that goes on in this area, in this field, and a lot of people stay in the field. We sometimes joke around that we must be crazy to stay in fields like this because it is an adrenaline rush, but it's insane to be exposed to this day after day for years on years and years, and returning home and not being able to relate well to your partner because all your energy is spent on protecting people that you're seeing in these traumatic situations. So I think that that is the problem for individual actors in civil society. It's this compassion fatigue. It's this, how do I take care of myself and still promote and do the work that I know I'm called to do, that I have to do? So I got out of the work before I came for the master's. I left this field, or I decided to leave entirely. And the reason why I left is because 2 weeks before I handed in a resignation, I watched a client of ours jump off the balcony. We were having a conversation and he ran off and jumped. And in that moment, I had to decide that I had to protect myself. It's not that I leave and the entire system crumbles. I'm just an actor in the system and I need to be okay to be able to continue this work. So at that point, I had lost everything, every motivation to do any of this work, to be part of anything human rights. I still refuse to refer to myself as an activist, or I just think I'm a person who has a calling and I have to do it. I don't think I don't label anything that I do because I think it adds some level of grandiosity to who I am and why I exist. I'm just like any one of you. I just got up and I did something. That's literally the difference, right? And I'm sure you all do stuff. So that's literally the difference. So we're all just regular people. Perfect. All right, so in moving to Padova, we created the student engagement team. It was about 11 students, and we created the student engagement team. And what we do is we promote human rights education through challenge-based learning. And we found that this was an outlet for us and a good way to put into action what we learn. So I'll share with you another professional experience, and that's a consultancy I did with the Calgary African Community Collective. And in this consultancy, I was introduced to systems change. And systems change is a concept that comes through the Water of Systems Change by John Kanye, Kramer, and Senge, and it's the process of shifting the conditions that are holding a problem in place. So this inverted triangle shows that framework that they put forward to advance equity. It dates back to many other researchers, but this is the one I'm choosing to highlight. And it happens at the structural explicit level, semi-explicit and implicit level. And it has to happen to each one of them to have that systems or transformational change happen, right? So at the structural level, we're seeing policies and practices. This is done clearly by governments. But as you move down the triangle, it gets a little more difficult because now we're looking at relational and power dynamics in organizations and in how we and how we relate to one another in daily life, in our families and stuff like that. When we get to mental models, it gets even more difficult because that requires individual work and individual change. And I think that's where we see issues like individuals creating a movement around themselves, around, let's say, right-wing movements, where an individual has motivated people through their mental model to follow the same mental model and then break down the entire triangle. So you can see systems change in the negative direction as well as in the positive direction. I was going to give you some examples of positive systems change, but maybe we'll talk about them in the discussion. They come from a study or a report put forward by the OECD, and these case studies were done in Iceland, one in Canada, and one in the Netherlands, and they look at different actors in society working together to come up with new legislature, to work with victims of domestic violence, but from a collective perspective, not just each individual working by themselves because they miss certain points of what's happening. Being the last person isn't as fun sometimes, but I'll finish with this, okay? So I wanted again to let you know why I said consider what you're asking of us. So again, I'm looking at this from the perspective of a Black woman, okay? And for us from the Black community, it's difficult for us to have these conversations in rooms where there are very few of us because our experiences are not the same as everyone else's. We love the conversation, let's do stuff, it's great, it's fantastic. But as you can see from this report produced from Canada, you saw it, they put out a report about funding for Black organizations through philanthropy, and Black organizations receive a lot less funding for the work they do because research isn't done about our communities. There seems to be a lack of interest in doing research about our communities, and they don't understand our needs because they're not listening to us. We say constantly and they're not listening, but then we enter rooms where people look like us aren't in those rooms, and then we're supposed to have these conversations like that's not a factor in what's happening, right? So the work is great, but from the perspective of, again, I can only speak of the Black community, it's still lacking in equity. And when we have these conversations, we want to have a more equitable, representative room of what's happening in society. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Christine, for rounding up this panel with your personal experiences, showing really perfectly how your experiences then really fueled human rights education and this easy access to low barrier access to human rights education here in Padova. So thank you very much to all of our discussants. It was really so interesting to listen to you, to all perspectives. I would have loved to continue your listening to you sharing your experiences. However, and this is what we talked about, Pietro and me, how we now will structure the Q&A session, that we will actually start with 2 questions from the panel by us. However, during the discussions, it's something we thought about in the beginning, how really to ask about the how civil society organizations and human rights education at higher education institutions like universities should work together have been addressed actually. So our starting question kind of lost its attractiveness. But what I would like actually more what came when you made your presentations, what came to my mind and which brings together or which kind of embeds this panel into the wider discussion of the conference, namely really this the shrinking civic space. And what came to my mind, I mean, it was J.D. Vance during the campaign, during the election campaign now in the United States, actually said the enemy is the professor. And this kind of instrumentalization also of human rights education, the framing of human rights education or the transportation of values as well, which became this increasing power tool as well, you know, to kind of abuse it, misuse narratives directly for political gain. And this is what you can see, what Dasha actually then said, like the political context where human rights defenders are working. But I was just wondering, like really how the political context of universities is changing as well, like in terms of academic freedom, like how really to ensure that universities doing higher human rights education, how to strengthen them, how to ensure that activists still have the space also in this in higher education to have their voices heard. So this is, I mean, I'm not sure whether this is questions actually that can be answered. I mean, there is no answer to that. It's rather, it's a comment, it's a problem raised. But yeah, I would somehow love to get your impressions here. 1 minute each. That's Pietro's call.
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I also teach part-time at Columbia University, which was kind of the ground zero in the United States for the Gaza Solidarity encampment that resulted in, at some point, police coming on campus and arresting students. So I'm sure I can't speak for other people who are in university here at this table, but certainly we have had very strong discussions about freedom of speech on campus. It's not resolved. Kind of tenuous, new kinds of fragmentation, I think, became revealed on campuses when faculty aligned themselves with students who were protesting and administrators clamped down. So we could talk a lot about this. I'm sure everybody who's at university has their own story around this. But I think what I took from that, which is, I think, pertinent for us, is inside of university that faculty themselves are sometimes vulnerable and their own human rights can be questioned. And certainly some of the fodder for critiquing critiquing universities in the United States, especially Ivy Leagues, has been, which is true in terms of, if you look empirically, is that most faculty are more progressive and liberal in their outlook. So there perhaps has not been enough attention to having university faculty hired with alternative points of view. So I think it raises a lot of questions about the role of the university in terms of public education, but I think there's still a lot of fractiousness on campuses that are unresolved. The other thing I want to say, I know it's more than a minute, but I want to say this off of Stasya's comments here. This has to do with faculty and civil society organizations in environments of authoritarianism. So I want to mention something that maybe hasn't come to mind or hasn't been mentioned anyway in this table, which is that sometimes civil society can actually be a sanctuary for university professors who are under siege. And I have two examples of this. One is Turkey, where many human rights academics were purged. And actually I was brought in to help these professors who could not leave the country, their passports were taken, to figure out how they could carry out human rights education online with the funding of well, some funder. But essentially, they operated then offering human rights education illegally, unofficially, without accreditation for students in Turkey so that they would still have some exposure to human rights if they wanted it. And I think that's a profound example of how also we're talking about universities, but ultimately we're also talking about individual members of faculties interested in human rights, right? Because we are also sometimes quite different than our colleagues. And in situations like in Turkey, they ended up teaching, but in essentially a civil society environment. And similarly, in Myanmar right now, there's a whole kind of shadow higher education happening that's not, sanctioned by the government, where human rights education is taking place. So I think we can also think a little bit around these fluid spaces of civil society and higher education in situations that Stasya mentioned of authoritarianism, and in cases where it's very dangerous for you also as an instructor to teach human rights.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of thoughts to that. I mean, thank you for sharing that quote from J.D. Vance. I hadn't heard that. And if he's looking at what we're doing and doesn't like it, then we're on to something good, right? We have power. But we know through the history of authoritarian regimes that often they come for the intelligentsia first, right? So we have to take very seriously those kinds of words from someone in power attacking the university, the academic community, etc. I've also done work on academic freedom, gathering academics in the UK to try and plead to universities for better protection of academic freedom in internationalization. So we created a model code of conduct with other universities have tried to incorporate, including our own, which has been a positive step to recognize the threats that our fellow academics in other parts of the world face through their research. Also in that research, I found lots of these examples of online learning as a space to reflect. You've just given two perfect illustrations from the Off University and universities in Myanmar. And I think what I found in that research, there is a lack of protection of academic freedom for students. So if there is a plea to you as students is to be vocal about what is your right to academic freedom, and that does the university protect that as well? Because that, for those of you working on human rights education for contentious issues, it's important that you have academic freedom to pursue the challenging issues in this field that you would like to.
I can be very quick. I think everything has been mentioned, and as you said, it's probably not even a question to answer. It's kind of rhetorical one. I think what can universities that enjoy more academic freedom do is to establish connections with those universities that suffer from the lack of academic freedoms. And I know, aside from the examples of the Turkish professors that Felisa mentioned, there is a whole university that has a lot of professors from Russia and Belarus who have been sacked, who are foreign agents, extremists in their own legislations, and there is a whole nomadic university of these professors existing online, sometimes offline in Georgia. And these are brilliant brains of the countries that we can tap into, and they have no registration, but brilliant, like dozens of courses that are online and that are free. Maybe establishing contacts with that university could be a good start to support their freedom, academic freedom.
And again, you've answered the question or this commentary really well. I would advocate, or I would say, to diversify with the times, find avenues that folks go to the most for the information they get. If all academic avenues are in traditional spaces, how are you translating that knowledge into ways that folks can absorb it as fast as possible to get that message across? Because if you're facing an imminent catastrophe, you want to get your information out there as fast as possible so people can mobilize around you. So unfortunately, I'm gonna say TikTok and I'm gonna say Instagram. I know we hate it, but that's where a lot of folks get their information from. So we need to utilize these spaces to get information out there.
Thank you very much. Actually, the program say 10:12. We have 10 minutes more, but I don't want to steal the opportunity for our audience to make questions. So I'll renounce for the moment to my privilege as a chair to make the question, and I'll open the floor for questions from the audience. And then if there is time, I will ask about my question, even because I clumsily close the browser with the video I wanted to show to make the questions. Okay, any questions from the audience? We can collect 3 of them and then ask the panel to answer. So we have Ian, Anna. Okay, go here.
I'll pass it when needed. And I want to thank you, all the panelists today, because it was not only academically very interesting, but also very inspiring, especially when you work with human rights. Indeed, I have a question for the 2 activists of the panel, Christine and Stasya, if I can call you by your first names. I myself try to be an activist in my local community, and I've seen many obstacles in collaborating with the local governments, especially to obtain fundings and support. So I wanted to ask you if you have any strategies to collaborate with the institution, especially when your aim do not precisely goes in the same route of the political party at the government at the moment. And also briefly, if you have any suggestion to avoid activist exhaustion, and when do you think it's the time to step down? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful contribution. And I would like to ask the question to Stasya. Firstly, thank you so much for sharing your point of view. I am from Poland, so everything that you said was very touching for me. And I was thinking about different things, such as, for example, breaking the rule of law in the recent years in Poland, and on how far we are on this path. And this is actually my question and request to get your commentary, because I'm thinking about Polish civil society, and I'm not sure if we are strong enough to take an attempt, the second attempt or the next attempt, if the space for civic actions and civil society will be limited once again in the next years, what we actually expect. And it was also very touching because as a part of Polish society, I can just feel this fear among people about the next steps of Putin's autocratic regime. So thank you so much. It was very clear and coherent for me. And to be honest, it's one of the best explanation of the genesis of the aggression to Ukraine that I have ever heard. So I'm grateful.
Thank you. That was a wonderful panel. Ian Turner from the University of Central Lancashire. I'm a human rights lawyer with particular expertise in civil and political rights. But particularly from a law perspective, we tend to prioritise civil and political rights because, of course, they're justiciable, whereas economic, social, cultural rights are more aspirational. Stasya mentioned the UDHR, but also I think it's often forgotten that UDHR includes references to economic and social cultural rights. And I think that often gets lost in human rights debates, particularly from a law perspective. And then obviously we appreciate that rights are interrelational, they're interdependent, but I think there's still, particularly from my discipline, a prioritisation of civil and political rights. So it's lovely to hear Lisa talk about social justice within the parts of education. But just a comment, but if people would happy to come back, that I think we also need to emphasise the significance of economic, social, cultural rights within the part of human rights education and social justice. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't have a lot of time to get my thoughts together to respond coherently, but I will try. So in terms of the first question about the activism, I feel your pain, especially when you're trying on a very local level to work with government who doesn't want to listen to you, treats you like you're something not welcomed. My only lessons learned is unite. Look for, support, friends who join you. Who even one person is already a lot. So when you unite, you feel much more powerful, much less. It's much. Just unite first. Look for support elsewhere. You don't have to face it alone because it can be daunting, and it is daunting. How to avoid exhaustion? I wish I knew. No, I can't share my lessons there. But be very careful and take care, put the mask on first on yourself, as you said, yeah, before helping others. Well, thank you so much on the comment about Poland and your kind words. Rule of law in Poland, definitely, and we've had a lot of research done and statements done as Amnesty underlying that this is at risk and under attack. I can just say that I think Polish civil society is very strong. And I know that, at least judging by my colleagues in Amnesty Poland, they are the ones that we work together on a regional level. They're not only focusing on Poland, but we work together and they understand on Hungary, very close, on Slovakia, Slovenia. So we join together so that, again, no one is faced alone with their own governments and its threats, or neighborhood governments, and neighbors. And I was very inspired in civil society in Poland about the response about anti-abortion laws, how they united around especially one person who sold her abortion pills to a girl who she wanted to help, and then it was discovered by her husband, and then that person who wanted to help was imprisoned, and how I unfortunately forgot her name, but I saw how it united civil societies, and that swayed the whole discussion in the country, if I'm not mistaken, and it was around the elections as well. That was so impressive in terms of people power. So with such strong civil society, you shouldn't be afraid, at least for now. Yes, next steps and fear about neighbors, I don't know, but we're in this together. Yes, and maybe I'll stop there and give it to others.
I'm just gonna answer the question about collaborating with governments you're not too keen on. So we had to do a lot of that in Alberta. It's so painful because the Alberta government is extremely, not extremely, it's quite conservative. It's like a mini Texas, okay? So that is very difficult when you're talking about things like decriminalizing drug use or decriminalizing sex work. It's so hard to talk about that stuff with them. But I'm a supporter of working from within, because I've found that when you're on the outside, you're hitting a wall, right? It requires a bit of rejigging your own personal beliefs, and it depends on if you want to do that or not. But you kind of have to be at that table if you want to do something about it, or have an ally at that table who really does believe in your cause and is not easily swayed. Otherwise, you're going to derail the whole discussion. But yeah, do it from within, and hopefully you bring other people with you, and then it changes that system through that way, while again, supporting folks who are outside of that, again, power system, to enter and to work with you. And in Canada, not in Canada, but I think in several places it's called self-care, what you asked about. it's kind of a buzzword, but it means what it means to you. If your thing is hanging out with friends, go hang out with friends. If you're, and also finding support, people who are dealing with what you're dealing with. If your thing is exercising, do that. I would also advise you to reflect upon the negative ways that you cope. I found that while working in this, the longer I worked with Aware, I started drinking more. I'm working with people dealing with addictions while I'm getting an addiction. How fun is that? But I had to stop and be like, what am I doing? What am I actually dealing with the trauma, or am I just suppressing it so that I can function? And it's easy to say, I just need to function. One more day, one more shift, and it will catch up with you. So take care of yourself. You're not helping anyone if you're not okay. Take care of you first. Take a break, come back. The world won't end because you decided to go on vacation. Like, it's okay.
So thank you to Ian for the question about the ESC rights and foregrounding that much more in human rights education. And I think I just want to pick up one of the things that made Stasya's intervention so powerful is she understood the historiography of human rights, right? And she used that to explain a contemporary challenge, which resonated very strongly with us. And I think if you look at the history of the development of human rights, there was not a privileging of civil and political rights over economic, social, and cultural rights. This is the Western narrative, right? So if you look at the Global South narrative, a decolonizing narrative, then we see that we can re-question this hierarchy, and that enables contemporary activists to say, okay, maybe economic, social, and cultural rights are justiciable. And we've seen trends in that in recent years, for sure. It definitely is. So I think understanding the history of human rights, supporting our students to understand that as educators is really important for challenging and for understanding contemporary issues as well as we see, and explaining them, as Stasya has done so well. And maybe if I can just pick up on this point about the exhaustion, and this came across really powerful in your talk as well, Christine, and also Stasya as well. I've been thinking about this a lot recently as an educator, because students come and ask me, particularly in relation to the Gaza war, students are really struggling, and they were looking for guidance on how do I deal with the emotion, the mental impact of this. So I feel like, as to all the educators here, we had to put this formally on our curriculum, right? How do you deal with self-care? How do you address it? How do you recognize signs of burnout? How do you mitigate that? So that's a kind of call to myself and to others, that we look at how to formalize education on this, so that when we're supporting the capacity of human rights defenders, we include the capacity to deal with resilience and to have strategies for that.
I don't have much to add, but again, to your point, Ian, of course, I do teach part-time in the United States, so this is also a very strong problem, the lack of attention to ECOSOC rights in contrast to civil and political rights. I don't teach in a law school, so I'm not maybe restricted in the ways that you felt you are, because you teach in a law school and they're so-called progressive rights, ECOSOC rights. But particularly because I am in the United States, I make it a strong point to bring out ECOSOC rights, because most likely American students haven't heard of them, or they've heard of civil and political rights in terms of constitutional rights. And so it's part of what I consider to be the value of looking at human rights, is that you look at the panoply of rights, and it's not just related to the US Constitution. One observation I've had around these, even though ECOSOC rights, we know historically, I love the historical perspectives that's been shared. We know that they've been, they're not recognized formally in the United States through human rights standards and ratifications, but nevertheless, we're seeing more and more language around using rights, right to housing, right to healthcare. And I know I started to observe that during the Obama campaign and got very excited about it. So maybe an interesting question, I'm not a lawyer, for those of you who are lawyers, is what does it mean that you have more kind of treatment of rights in the vernacular, if you will, the right to housing, right to healthcare, right to an affordable wage, even reproductive rights in the States, without that being necessarily recognized as being linked with the international human rights framework. I think it's an interesting question, but I would say that there is that, I think that consciousness is happening in the States, and it's not linked with constitutionalism.
I think we can collect a couple of quick questions, maybe. Yes? One there. Where's the mic? Oh, we lost the mic. Ah, no. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Because we did a lot of, noise to have a microphone for this room.
Oh, hello everyone. Thank you for all your presentations. Maybe it's a bit too broad question, but I would like to ask you the whole plenary session about the educational critical theories and approaches that you have experienced during your career, and not only regarding university education, but also considering younger generations, so school level education. I would like to know more about the practice you have worked with, and also considering human rights education, the colonial approaches, so not only good practices you have faced in projects, for example, Escola da Ponte in Portugal, but other experience you could share with us. And another question I have is regarding formal human rights education, not only to the law and political science departments of our universities, but to other departments. How could we spread the language of human rights to other departments that are not necessarily related to political science, for example, engineers, and so on? Thank you.
Thank you. And my question is for the two activists. I'm from Cameroon, and it was very inspiring to hear your stories. And I would like to have some suggestion on how to help the people maybe to manage an organization or to be an activist from a distance. Like I'm here in Italy, but I would also love to do something for my country there in Cameroon.
All right, I'll just get started. I think that Corinne can, and Stasya particularly, can talk to the question about critical pedagogy. There is a lot of literature now on human rights education and ways of organizing it in ways that kind of achieve the goals we would like to. That's not just cognitive learning, but also affective and also moving in towards action. So I don't think I need to, I mean, it would take a lot of time to talk about it, but there is a lot of information about that now through experience. And the experience originally came from the civil society sector and sort of migrated into higher ed. So I'm happy we can talk, exchange information. I'm happy to put you in touch with some really good research on critical pedagogy and other ways of carrying out HRE that I think is pretty effective. Corinne mentioned decolonization as an interest. Also, I'm super interested in decolonization of human rights and human rights education. Again, I think at this point in the panel, maybe it's, I don't want to say too much about it, but to say that that is one of the interesting areas now that are being considered. There's two human rights education journals. I don't know if you know about them. One is the Human Rights Education Review, and the other is Journal for Human Rights Education. One of them, I think it's the Human Rights Education Review, is having a special issue just on decolonizing HRE. So I think in the field of academia, nicely, there is a lot on that relates to your first question. And again, rather than take up more time, I'll just happy to share more information about that. In terms of the different disciplines, I mean, there are people in this room who are working in multidisciplinary human rights centers, and the Global Campus for Human Rights is a prolific program that works in this way. At Columbia University, where I am, I'm affiliated with the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, also multidisciplinary. You know, in the old days, the human rights centers were just in law schools. And as human rights centers continue to be initiated, you're finding them more and more that they are multidisciplinary. I'm still fascinated by this, actually, that I'm working on a book now with a couple of other people, and we're actually trying to look at discipline-based perspectives on teaching and researching human rights. So it's not even just arts and sciences. We're looking at architecture and biomedical engineering and social work, and in addition to the standard disciplines, how they, in their disciplinary approach, can do research and add, insights into human rights themes, human rights issues, and vice versa, how the human rights human rights practice and human rights challenges can give an agenda for research and teaching to these disciplines. So it's a super cool question. I'm also really taken up by it. And hopefully that book will come out. Open access, we hope, in a couple of years, and that'll add more to the understanding of this.
All right, experts in academia, but what we do with SET, so I'm gonna answer from a concrete example of what you just asked about. So for SET, we specifically use challenge-based learning. And what that means is you sit through class, you go back, you reflect, you apply every kind of knowledge you have. Maybe you've taken an economics class and they talked about social enterprises. How can that relate to human rights law? Can you create a social enterprise that deals with human rights law? So you challenge yourself to see what you can come up with. Nothing is a bad idea. It also goes back to systems thinking and design thinking, right? Again, take a theory and think about a real world problem and then see how that theory can create a solution for that problem. That's literally what we did. I don't even think it's a science. Just sat down, saw a problem, thought about a theory, put them together, and thought about what we'd create. Very many steps in between, but that's basically the formula we used, and I think it's what Advocacy Hub has done as well, right? In terms of helping from afar, we started SET during COVID, and everything happened online. And as we went back to our countries to visit, we looked at our communities, we looked at other students in our communities, and we thought, can we take this and do this in our own communities? So I'm looking at doing it in Uganda as well. Again, difficult because I go back and forth, but I'm looking at doing it in Uganda, connecting to Makerere University, which is also a partner with the University of Padova, different universities, and seeing if students there can create their own SET. And the idea behind that is that I don't own the idea. I want to share the idea. I give you the idea. I'll give you all the knowledge about it. It's not mine. It's for us to share and to use to create something. So I think it's the same idea as open source kind of coding, or they use the same idea. They create something and they could monetize it, but the idea is to make information accessible to other people. So they give it out for free. So that's what we do as well. We give out the template for free, create something somewhere. Do it from here, do it online, use a website, use Instagram, use whatever you can, and create something and then share it online. And then when you go back, you connect in person with these folks. And that's about
it. So just quickly, because I know we're running out of time, just responding quickly to so the approaches to human rights education. I'm not going to go into all the theoretical names. Many of it has been mentioned already, which is traditionally used, like experiential learning, learning through practice, learning by doing. I'll just say that for me, the most important thing in my pedagogy, in looking for instruments, is how it is connected with who I am. So we teach who we are. You build yourself first as an activist, as a human rights defender, and then what you teach will work. Yeah? You will find tools how to transmit it. On Cameroon and how we can act while not being maybe in the place where the things that resonate with us are happening. So for me, it's the same as this question about being alone. So unite, look for those around you who are worried by the same concerns that you have. And then online, digitally, really just join networks, groups that can work together on some digital action on the problem that you are most concerned in Cameroon. That's how whole Amnesty movement works. We're uniting digitally and then acting all together on specific issues. And also on the, yeah, maybe that's it. Thank you. No time.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for this brilliant panel. It was terrific. Thank you. I would like to. So as the conference closes and actually students from the next class are joining us, hello. I would just simply like to thank all the partner discussants and students who participated actively in this conference, and the organizing committee that helped to make it a success. I already mentioned them yesterday, but Katia, Donatella, Luca, the two Sophias, and the civil service volunteer Alexandrina, Federica, Giuliana, and Lydia, plus the interns. Thank you very much. You did a great job.